Oh gosh, there's so many people.
Huh.
There's not enough.
That's not enough.
I feel like I'm the odd one out being the only Aussie here, eh? Bloody
It's like
hell.
3 a.m. there, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm gonna get on my PC. I'm not doing this on the phone. I'll be right back.
Yeah. For a sec.
So are you gonna be moderating?
Yes, I
Or
will.
you take? Sweet. How you gonna do the questions?
Miles also has the ability to mute and unmute if things get out of hand. The plan is we'll just mute everybody, and then as Miles calls on people, either me or somebody else will unmute them.
Sounds pretty good.
But that's just if things get out of hand. So
I mean, I think most people will be mature. Most.
yeah, it should be.
You
I'm
hope.
gonna be the maturest, okay? That's
I
a
didn't
fact.
even hear a word you said. Nah, look, honestly.
Okay, I can see like there are like 10 people in the thing that can't talk right now. Is that a result of the limitation of the voice chat, or?
No, that's because they've got their mics muted. So,
Okay,
for
so
example,
that's
if you right click, if
Can
you
you guys
go,
hear me?
look,
Yeah.
so you see at the bottom how you could mute yourself near your.
Yeah, no, I
As
can
soon
see
as
that, but people
Yeah.
like Nora and Red and all them, they're normally talk. Red, can you say something? Red Charlotte.
Red is probably doing something. That's why he's done that last time
Okay.
as well.
Okay.
Hello.
Nair, can you say something?
I have a turn.
Yep, I
There
can
are
talk.
20 more people.
Oh, okay. Okay. Just checking.
Sorry, I was plugging up another computer.
Oh wow.
Oh wow. Yeah,
Oh,
your mic
dear.
is.
That's
yeah,
really
okay.
lagging.
Well,
Yeah, just turn off your mic. Thank you very much, Mr. Now, look, with all honest opinion, most teens, they are mature, but the thing is, when things get out of hand, they can't control themselves. Then they get out
Oh
of
yeah.
hand. Where older people can hold back on that latter section of not going crazy when everything goes crazy. I think that's why.
Like classroom mentality.
Pretty much, that's why you're still at school, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
How you going?
I'm having so much trouble with trying to catch this tentacruel.
Josh is an adult for sure.
So I'm guessing,
a
so this is your
well-behaved
first.
person.
This is your first Discord you're really on, huh?
Who are you asking?
Does this sound okay? Is it too echoey?
No, you sound fine.
I was
Alright,
telling
thanks.
you, so this is your first Discord that you're actually part of, isn't it?
What, me? Voice chat?
You sound new to it.
No, I've done voice chat for years.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, like not like Discord. Like I'm not familiar with.
No, I was saying Discord.
Yeah. No, I don't. Well, we've never managed something this big, and I don't know how Discord behaves when there's like 30 people in the voice chat. So, you know,
It might tap out as well. Some people might not be able to join.
No, I don't think it will cap.
Is it
Yeah.
true that
It might not
some
have a limit though.
No, it
if there's red
won't
light
cap.
and dark?
I've been in channels where there was like 40 people. So.
Hello, Miles.
Hey, everybody.
Big on Miles. Good morning.
This is good crazy. Morning. Hello. All right, so we're going to take about 2 minutes, let everybody log on here, and then we're going to get started, okay?
What are we doing?
Cool.
I'm actually surprised by the turnout that we have here. It's awesome.
What are we doing, like?
I'm asking everybody if you don't already have it set, please set your mic to push to talk.
Yep.
All right. What are we
Yeah,
doing?
mine is on push to talk at the moment. It's just not muted.
Same.
Working on it.
Is there an event happening or something? What's going on?
Yeah, there's an event here. I'm gonna link in the voice text channel.
Mute and unmute.
What's going
Just
on?
mute and unmute, Steven.
Okay.
Okay, if you look in the voice to text channel, there's a link to the information for what's going on.
You can't even see.
But it'll.
Why is there so many people? What is going on?
We'll cover the. All right. Okay. If things get out of hand, if like just people are just being inconsiderate of others, and there's so many, just because there's so many people in the voice chat, I'm just gonna mute people. And if you have a question or something, put it in voice to text, just so that this is a little bit more manageable. Okay. If you're hard muted, that is. So I don't know if we're gonna get to that point, but I'm kind of expecting we will. So we'll see.
What's going on? Can someone please explain?
Yeah, all right, muted.
Was that Red's distinctive laugh?
No, that was Gandalf's laugh.
Oh.
Okay, Brick, do me a favor. Brick, listen to me very carefully, okay? Above general voice, there's a channel called voice text. Can you please click on that for me? So what we're doing, we're doing a talk. Miles is going to give us a talk on fundamentals of good formicariums. Then after that, we're gonna have a question and answer session. Then after that, he's gonna be talking about the laws and permits. So pretty much what you're doing now is just sitting down and listening like you would do at school when your principal talks or your teacher. Yeah, it's answerable.
Sure.
So if you're gonna if you want a question answered, put your hand up, and when it's your turn, we'll get. Okay, if you have a question or whatever, just go to voice text and type it in. If there's people obviously talking and the conversation's going on, just don't talk over Miles or Sol, whatever you do.
All right, everybody, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Alrighty, well, let's get started. Hello, Curious Minds. I'm Miles, and welcome to the first Ant and Ant Keeping Discord server AMA. We'll be using the voice text channel for this discussion. If you need to post pictures along with your questions, you can do so there. I'll also add information as necessary in the channel, depending on how our chat goes today. First off, I'd like to introduce myself to you all, and then I'll lay out the format for today's discussion. I'm Miles Maxer. I've been keeping ants for a little over a decade now, and I've been researching their care in captivity for the past 4 years. I currently study environmental science, science communication, political science, and entomology at Montana State University in Bozeman. At MSU, I'm privileged to be the primary caretaker for an insect laboratory where I keep dozens of ant colonies and a handful of other arthropod species. I also work as a federal contractor for the United States government, and right now I'm working with the National Park Service to learn more about the ants of Yellowstone National Park. Finally, I am also the founder and director of the Ant Network, a science outreach and media organization designed to share our love of ants with the world. We produce exciting videos, educational exhibits, and we will soon be launching an informative website to help educate others about ant keeping. This summer, we are filming in Idaho, Montana, Arizona, and Madagascar, and the whole team is super excited to be making this content for you to enjoy. I've really enjoyed my time here on this server, and I'm thankful to be a part of this community, and I'm excited to be here to talk to you today. As the announcement said, today will function like an open seminar. To begin with, I will be talking about some of the fundamentals of formicariums, which I hope will help you all in either making your own or deciding which ones to purchase for your ants. After that, I will take your questions related to formicariums. some other questions after that, and then I'll finish the session by giving a quick primer on the laws surrounding ant keeping and the United States Department of Agriculture's permitting process. I will welcome questions related to that topic at the very end. Before I dive into the fundamentals of Formicariums, are there any questions about the format we are using today? Excellent. Good stuff. All right. Well, I'm very fortunate to have been mentored by Ray Mendez. Some of you will recognize that name, and he's the world's foremost insect display specialist. Nearly every insect zoo or live ant colony that you've seen on display has come from him. Many of the tips and topics of discussion I have prepared have come out of my discussions with him and my own experience in the field. Ray and I agree that the most important aspect of keeping ants is doing so ethically, and that includes making the health of your ants your top priority. To really do this, you need to learn everything you can about the ant species you are keeping, and if possible, observe their behaviors in the wild. You should also be prepared to make compromises between your ideas and desires for the colony and their actual biological needs. So, for example, species like Myrmecocystus, also known as honeypot ants, need vertical surfaces to hang their repletes from. You might wish to display them in like a horizontal acrylic nest, but that would not be what's best for the ants. So it's really important to understand the biology of the ants you're keeping when you're selecting or designing a formicarium for them. All right. I'm just checking the chat here to make sure that we're all set. Good stuff. Okay, so the number one topic that I really want to go through with you is just how important it is to balance kind of the ideas you have for what you want to do with a formicarium and also what the ants need themselves. When I'm designing a formicarium, looks like we have a question, how long does this last? As long as it's going to take, but it'll probably be around an hour. So hopefully that works okay for everybody. All right, so going back to that, it's really important that you focus on learning as much as you can about the ant species that you're keeping, because that's going to inform the kinds of formicariums that you're either designing or purchasing for them. All right, I'm looking at the chat here.
Yeah, just a minute. We're just making sure that everybody can hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, 36 voice chat members lagging us out. Yeah, this is pretty good turnout for like the first one. Okay, it seems like we're good. I think it's just Red having problems.
Okay, I'm sorry about that, Red. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I would like to thank Sol for organizing this and getting this all possible. It's been kind of a logistical challenge for us, but hopefully it comes out okay and everybody learns and has some fun. So that's my goal here. Okay. So when I'm looking at different ant species that I'm going to keep, the first thing I do, if possible, is I go and find them in the wild. I want to make sure that I understand what they're doing in the wild, especially the kind of area where I'm collecting the ants from, to understand their biology and their behavior. If you're not able to do that, that's just fine, but you're going to want to make sure that you read up on that species as much as possible. Hold on one second. Okay, good. Looks like we're in good shape. There are a couple of great resources for that. There's an ant wiki being developed that I'm aware of. There's also some books. You know, The Ants by Holdobler and Wilson is sort of referred to. Sorry, I just got pinged, so I'm just looking at that.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to state really quickly. Maybe between points, just pause for questions since people are a little scared to interrupt.
Yeah, sure thing. I'm going to wrap up this one and we'll talk through it. Oh, no.
Are people...
It looks like we're posting our percentages. Okay. Well, I'm going to move on. Good luck finding a charger. So anyway, I do have a question here. What do you think are the best ant books? So as I was saying, there's a great book Huldobler and Wilson put together called The Ants, but it's starting to get a little bit outdated. When you're trying to learn about kind of the genera of ant species present in like North America, Brian Fisher and Stephen Cover did a great guide called The Ants of North America. So that's one that I would recommend as well. If you're looking for a book just like a field guide for insects in general, the Kaufman Field Guide to Insects of North America is a great one. Unfortunately, guys, I don't have a lot of knowledge when it comes to books in, say, Europe or Asia, but I can definitely find those resources later on if you need those, and just send me a message, okay? Excellent.
Excuse me. Why are there like a jillion people in here?
Who was that?
Why are there like 50 people in this voice chat?
I can't even see who's talking. It's too long.
There's too many. I know. I don't know who's talking.
It's Captain Plutonium.
No, it is the ghost of ant keeping.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna mute you. You can check up in voice chat. Alright. Yeah, no, sorry. Normally Discord is a lot more like formal, you know, so people usually just hop in, and it kind of makes sense. If they didn't catch the notification, it makes sense that they're kind of confused.
Absolutely. Milta might have some good book recommendations, by the way. So he could be a great resource on that. All right, I'm going to move on to a topic of lighting. So I get quite a few questions about whether or not people should keep their ants in total darkness, if they should keep them in light, if there should be a day-night balance, that kind of thing. And what I do in my laboratory is I keep my ants in the light during the day and then in the dark at night. And essentially, what I do, no Fortnite. Essentially, what I do is the moment I catch a queen or a colony, they go into the main collection. And that collection is lit by overhead lights throughout the day, and then those lights go off at night. And essentially what that does is it gets the ants used to having light so they don't panic whenever there's light shown on them. That's my approach. That's important for my research and being able to observe the ants without disturbing them because there's light. I do recommend keeping your ants somewhat in light, but not like bright sunlight or really close lights, if that makes sense. That being said, you can start colonies, especially of difficult to raise species, in the dark if that's going to make the queens more comfortable. But my personal preference is just to have my area well lit. The ants seem to get used to it. They don't have any issues with it. And then they're more adapted to go on display, for example, at a children's museum where there's going to be light on them. Or when we're doing bright lights and filming for the Ant Network, the ants aren't nearly as disturbed as if there were no lights on them previously. Fish, it looks like you've got a question.
Fish, you're not muted. I don't know if you have a mic or not, but you can just talk.
Looks like you might be typing it out.
Yeah, just use the emote and ask the question. He'll read your question so everybody can hear it, and then we can go from there.
Yeah. Okay. He'll ask later. So are we all clear on lighting? I do recommend that you use LED lights whenever possible. They're more power efficient, and they also don't put out nearly as much heat, so you're less likely to warm the ant colony too much. All right, looks like Red's submitted a question. Are there any species that are especially sensitive to light? Absolutely. So some ant species are actually called cryptic, and that means that they live almost entirely in like the soil in darkness. They don't come up above the soil or leaf litter to collect food. And those cryptic ants can be particularly sensitive to light. They're a good exception to my lighting rule. So I have a Ponera pennsylvanica colony, for example. They, to my knowledge, they have a little bit of kind of light sensors, but they don't have fully developed eyes. I keep them a little bit darker because it seems to be less disruptive to them. Okay. I'm just taking a look at these questions. What about subterranean ants, which are generally blind? Well, blind subterranean ants aren't going to notice the light, right? If they don't have eyes that are functional, then they're not likely to be disturbed by light, so you should be all good there. Okay, we've got a question from Big Gandalf. Do you suggest keep founding stage ants in light during the day as well, or only colonies? I keep founding stage ants in the light. So whenever I collect a queen, I put her in a founding formicarium or a test tube, and we have the light on them during the day and off at night. That way they get used to that light as quickly as possible. I want them to be used to it. Do I notice light sensitivity affecting foraging behavior of captive colonies? Excellent question, Sol. Basically, no. There are definitely ants that are diurnal and nocturnal. So some of the carpenter ant species are primarily nocturnal. They only really forage at night, so I don't see them foraging during the day. But I don't think it affects their behavior in a negative way, is what I would say. Okay, does the light color matter? I'm not sure about that question. But if you have really bright lights, that might be more disruptive than kind of a lower light. But I'm not sure that the light color matters all that much. That being said, there's sort of a hypothesis that some ant species can't see light in the red spectrum. So you could light with that, but that's really under debate. And there's definitely some evidence to show that the ants do see red light. It's just that it's less bright and less disruptive than regular light. Ant Duchess, have you figured out what's going on yet? So basically, we're just doing a Ask Miles Anything kind of session as an ant keeper, so I can talk to you guys about some of the fundamentals of keeping ants. Today, we're focusing on formicariums and kind of the fundamentals that you need to know when you're designing or purchasing a formicarium. Okay, can ants adapt to light over time? Are queens more sensitive on account of their ocelli to light than workers? So I don't know if we have scientific data showing that queens are more sensitive to light in a negative way in terms of ant keeping, but they certainly are more sensitive to light when it comes to behavior in the wild. So queens use those ocelli in part to help them navigate when they're flying. I believe that ants do sort of adapt to light over time. I see behavioral changes from maybe when they're collected to a month or a year down the road. They are much less scared and disrupted by light than when they're first collected and they're used to being in the dark. Okay. Question: if a display is not needed, such as for hobbyists, will colony health generally be better without a light cycle? We don't really have necessarily good data on that, but I personally doubt it. You know, Ray and I have been keeping ants for I've been keeping ants for a decade. Ray's been keeping ants for years and years in the light, and they tend to do very well. So I'm not sure that that would be a major issue. Milt is correct as well. If the ants are acclimated to light, they're still going to prefer living in the dark, but it's much less disruptive to them if they're acclimated to that light. Okay, so unless we have any other big questions, I'm going to move on to another topic. Oh, here's one. Views on heating lamps. Heating lamps are an interesting situation where you don't want to turn your formicarium into a greenhouse. So if you're using a heating lamp, you've really got to be able to maintain and monitor the temperature in the formicariums, especially when they're highly glass-based like test tubes, because they can really heat up. I don't use heating lamps for that reason, but I know plenty of ant keepers who do. I prefer to use heating cables that are controlled by a little module that can control the temperature. I find that that's a more reliable system. There's definitely different folks who like to use heating lamps. I would be really careful when using a heating lamp on a very small container. All right, I'm just trying to keep up on this chat here. A colony on a claustral foundation, so founding in a claustral chamber, has no light at any time in nature. Can it not affect the queen's sense of security and therefore the laying of eggs? It actually can affect that. But from my point of view and my experience, the queens that are raised in light in their founding chambers seem to do just fine. So that hasn't been an issue for me. But you're absolutely right that a founding colony generally wouldn't have light in nature. Another question, is it a good idea to do a day-night cycle with your heating control, like turn it off at night but have it on during the day? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. But what I do is I do have a day-night cycle where during the day when it has light, the heating cables are on, and during the night it turns off. I'm not sure that that's necessary, but I choose to do that with my colonies. Okay. Sam PPU asks a question, which size test tube do you recommend? I'm focusing on the light sensitivity. Sol's absolutely right. There are exceptions to everything that I'm saying, but I'm going to talk generally for most species that are kept in captivity. But Sam, you asked the question, which size test tube do you recommend? In our test tube video on the Ant Network's YouTube channel, we actually talk about that. But I use I think it's a 18 millimeter by 150 millimeter test tube from Fisher brand. Okay, I'm going to move on to another topic, viewing. So when you're designing or purchasing a Formicarium, viewing angles and materials is a big consideration to make. My preferred material to look into an ant nest is museum glass. That's a special glass with a certain kind of coating that reduces glare. It's very transparent, and it's great for filming. However, museum glass is quite expensive. If you're going to use regular glass, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, Tenebris nova, hopefully I'm saying that correctly. Museum glass is awesome. It's used on most of the displays. I interned at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., and all of those displays are built with museum glass. Tar Heel Ants also does museum glass. Oh no, I'm sorry, Aunt Duchess. All right, yep, absolutely right. THA does use museum glass on Formicariums, but you do have to do a special order when you do that. Acrylic can be a good material to use. However, when it comes in contact with water for a long period of time, it can kind of buckle, so it becomes less flat, and the plane is a little bit messed up. So you got to be aware that acrylic over time, when subject to moisture, at least most forms of acrylic, will warp. Great question about Lexan and polycarbonate. I don't know the answer to that. I don't use polycarbonate with any of my designs. So the other thing is that the thin acrylic is much more likely to be subject to that than, say, a thicker acrylic like 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch acrylic, but then it gets a lot more expensive. So I do recommend using museum glass whenever possible, but there are other options out there. Okay, what's the major concern when working on a budget and, say, using picture frame glass with AAC? Absolutely no, there's nothing wrong with using picture frame glass, especially on an AAC Formicarium. But my preference, just as a ant keeper, as someone who does a lot of video, I prefer museum glass. AAC is autoclaved aerated concrete, otherwise known as YTOG. It is not widely available in North America, but it is widely available in places like Australia and Europe. It's a great material that you can use to make Formicariums. Big Gandalf is correct as well. Fire brick can be used. It's not the same thing as autoclaved aerated concrete, but it can be used as a substitute, and some folks have had great success using that. Yes, fire brick is different. Okay, another question. Does dusty sand make a difference to not so dusty sand? I'm not exactly sure what dusty sand refers to, so if you can clarify that, that would be great. I'm going to continue on here. So behavior, you want to make sure that you understand the behaviors of your ants when you're picking out a Formicarium. I used the Myrmecocystis example earlier, so now I'm going to talk about Formica. So Formica is one of the largest species of ants in North America. Unfortunately, it's also one of the most difficult ones to identify, but the queens are frequently found. What did I say, Milta? Anyway, yeah, Formica is one of the largest. Yes, thank you, genera in North America. And anyway, those queens are frequently found. A common mistake that's made with them is that folks raise them in things like test tubes or acrylic formicariums that have no substrate in them. Well, the larvae of species like or genera like Formica tend to have a hard time spinning their cocoons. And then the mortality rate is also often higher with naked pupae in the Formica genus and some other genera as well. So you want to make sure that you understand that if you're raising Formica, you most likely need to have some form of substrate in the Formicarium so those cocoons can be spun. That's pretty much ubiquitous throughout the Formicinae. So that's like Lasius, Formica, etc. And also Ponerines tend to need substrate. So that's like Odonomachus or Ponera. Okay, Big Gandalf asks, would it not be better to always use substrate with any founding queens? That would be my opinion, yes. I prefer to have a little bit of substrate available for founding queens. However, I'm sorry, Sol. Anyway, however, not everybody shares that opinion. But I choose to raise all of my queens with a little bit of substrate that they can move around. I find that to be a beneficial thing to do. Okay, another behavior that you should be aware of is brood partitioning. Red, I'll get to you in a second, but with brood partitioning, ant colonies will actually put their brood in different parts of the nest because of the environmental conditions in those areas of the nest. So, for example, Pogonomyrmex will stratify their brood throughout the nest itself, depending on the temperature, depending on the humidity. So what you want to do, if you can, is have a formicarium that has varied temperatures, varied humidity gradients, and moisture gradients, so that they can partition their brood to what conditions are best for certain brood types. So if I'm making a nest for, let's say, a Phaenogaster, what I do is I make sure that there are little divots in the formicarium, kind of in the bottom of the plaster, where they can put their larvae and their eggs and their pupae. They like to sort those things and those brood items, and then have them placed in different areas. And the little divots are kind of dishes in the material, help to contain the larvae, because a lot of folks don't realize larvae are actually quite mobile in some ant species. When I was in Arizona, I actually saw Myrmecocystis larvae, which are the honeypot ants, actually like crawl for multiple inches away from where they were to try and find food or get attention from workers. So having the little divots and dishes in the formicarium, they crawl like maggots. Melt is exactly right. It's really kind of disturbing. But anyway, having those dishes and stuff will help the ants partition their brood to the best areas. Tenebris asks, does the layout of a formicarium's tunnels and chambers have any real impact on the ants? I ask because most species seem to have their own designs in the wild. Absolutely. So ant species like Pogonomyrmex have nests pretty similar to what he shared there, where they have these kind of circular dish-shaped chambers that aren't very tall, but they're very wide. And when I design a nest for something like for like Pogonomyrmex, I want a horizontal nest that gives them lots of surface area horizontally. Whereas ants like Myrmecocystis, the honeypot ants, they want a big, deep chamber where the honeypot ants the repletes can hang from the ceiling. There's lots of room, lots of airflow. So absolutely, the layout of a formicarium's tunnels and chambers definitely impacts ants and their behavior. Okay. And then finally, the design of an ant nest can have a huge amount of weight when it comes to the ant's sense of security. So species like genera like Ponerines, so Odonomachus, the trapjaw ants, they need nests that aren't super spread out. They want to have pretty tight, controlled chambers and tunnels where there's not a lot of airflow, there's not a lot of space, and they seem to be much more comfortable in that. All right, so I'm going to move on to humidity and moisture. It's really important that folks understand that humidity is a different thing than surface moisture. So the humidity in the air is very important for ants. It's one of the reasons that test tubes are popular, is because the humidity inside of a test tube is very high. The drawback from that is that certain ant species prefer lower humidity than what test tubes offer. So something like Camponotus, which are the carpenter ants, they actually prefer a humidity that's far lower than what your normal humidity would be like in a test tube. Now, that's a generalization, but I'm pretty confident making that. So having different kinds of Formicaria that have different humidity levels can be a huge benefit. One way that works is, so let's take the Tar Heel Ants mini hearth, for example. Mac actually installs little dishes that have this great mesh covering over them, and you fill them about halfway up with water. Well, as that water evaporates, it raises the humidity inside the Formicarium. Okay, but humidity is not the same thing as surface moisture, and that's part of why I like stone-based nests a lot more than nests that are based on like plastic, like acrylic or 3D printed materials. I'll talk about how those can be adapted for ants, and they can actually work very well. But by and large, I like using hydrostone or hydrocal to create Formicaria because it allows for different moisture gradients. The areas where the plaster is the most moist is usually where the ants will put their larvae, sometimes their eggs, and then in the drier, warmer sections of the nest, they'll usually put the pupae. Okay, I'm taking a look at questions right now, so I don't get too far behind on that. Great question here. How do you deal with the trade-off between not having a nest too big for ants and having a nest that they can grow into? This is absolutely, a challenge that pretty much every ant keeper has to deal with at some point, where, you don't want to get a nest that's too small, where it's not worth, the purchase price and the investment that you're making. But at the same time, if you get a nest that's too big, the ant colony won't function correctly. They'll be a little bit more stressed, and the workers might even get lost before they're able to bring food back to the colony. So what I personally do is I create modular formicariums. So like the Petri dish nests, which we're going to do a tutorial, hopefully that comes out next week or the week after. But those ones are modular so that you can connect lots of them as the colony grows. And I'm excited to cover more of the modular formicarium styles with the Ant Network over the next month or so. But it's a balancing process, and you have to understand the biology of the ants that you're keeping. So with, say, carpenter ants, Camponotus species, at least in North America, except for Florida, those colonies grow very slowly. So if you put them in a large nest, they're not going to grow into that nest for a long time, and you're more likely to see trash buildup, refuse buildup in the nest, which will cause mold and bacteria growth. So you need to kind of balance the kinds of species that you're keeping and the different kinds of nests. But that's why I really like the modular designs where you can just connect another nest and then you kind of double the space the ants have. And that way the setup grows as the colony grows. Okay, should you use loose substrate so the ants can dig their own tunnels, or make them tunnels in like AAC? Well, that really depends on the kinds of ants that you're keeping and the kind of ant keeping experience that you like. Quite a few Europeans prefer to use the soil type nests from places like Ant Store. And while that's not as much of a popular system here in the United States, that's one where you can actually observe the ants digging their own tunnels. So I don't have a preference on that. What you should be aware of is that soil nests and sand nests are more likely to collapse. So you're kind of taking a risk there. And the ants are also going to have an easier time hiding from view. If you create your own nest where you make the tunnels in like AAC or hydrostone, the ants aren't really going to be able to customize it too much, so you're never going to not be able to observe them. Okay, let's see. I'm just looking for more questions. Okay, we're going to move on to, Red asks, what's your preferred substrate? Depends on the kind of formicarium, depends on the ants, but I like to use kind of mid-grain, fine-grained sand. If possible, I like to use it from kind of the habitat the ants are in, so that when you're designing a formicarium for like video or display, it matches kind of the natural situation that those ants are in. That being said, you do have to go through the sterilization process to get the substrate ready. So you need to bake the substrate in the oven for a little while so that it is sterilized as best as you can. I also like to use substrates like the coconut shell substrate. That can work fine. You can also do coconut fiber substrates. But what you have to do, yes, Melt is correct. You can get seeds sprouting if you don't kill them. But what you need to do is monitor for mold. If you're using a lot of substrate, especially from organic matter, you could have mold outbreaks. Puppeteer, I don't have that information with me right now, but I could do that at some point.
If I can just add really quick, Miles.
Yeah.
A lot of I know for Drew's Formicariums, he will he has like, I think it's a two or three step process. He sifts his sand 3 different times to like make the grain of the sand more uniform. And he also, his mixture is that sifted sand and then 50% clay as well to prevent tunnel collapse.
Yes, that's great. Absolutely, you want to sift that, get rid of kind of the stuff you don't want, and get it down to a manageable and kind of predictable coarseness. So that's
it'll
great.
Also prevent like dust building up on the sides and stuff. So
yes, for sure. And if you wash the sand, that can really help reduce the amount of dust that you see on the side. But I think one of the questions that I didn't really talk through enough about was what my preferred substrate is for nests that aren't substrate based, right? Where it's not like a full ant farm filled with soil. I like to use things like vermiculite, that sterilized sand again, and just a little bit in the formicariums. So if I'm making, say, a hydrostone formicarium, I actually paint the sand on to the hydrostone when there's a thin layer of it. That's not something I'm going to be able to explain in this chat, but you are going to see a video tutorial coming from the Ant Network on that. Let me review the questions here. Would you recommend wooden nests in particular for carpenter ants? That's a great question. We don't really understand how to keep true carpenter ants in captivity when it comes to the northern range, the Nearctic Camponotus from Europe and North America. There are very few large colonies from those species that do well. I do want to kind of caveat that and say that the desert species are sort of an exception to that rule, and so are species like Camponotus floridanus, for example. But what I'm talking about is like Camponotus pennsylvanicus, Modoc, Novae boracensis, different species like that. We don't really know how to keep them, and that's clear because there are very few successful colonies that live longer than 3 years. One of the reasons I think that is because there's something that we're doing wrong in the dietary process. So that's some of my study right now is actually focused on the nutritional ecology of carpenter ants to help us kind of answer why they don't seem to do well in captivity. I think another part of that is that our nesting materials don't lead to them being very, very comfortable. They could be sterilizing those ants' gut microbiology. So essentially, to get back to your question, I think we should try wooden nests for carpenter ants, but we maybe need to rethink how we do that. Okay, how do you handle mold outbreaks? Well, first of all, the big thing that you should be doing is handling the size of the colony. So you're much more likely getting mold outbreaks when the colony is either in a nest that's too big or they've been in the nest for a very long time and the refuse and the garbage has just piled up over time. So the main management tactic that I actually use is I prevent the mold outbreaks from happening in the first place by making sure that you don't have too much, essentially, space inside the formicarium where mold's going to come out. The other thing that I would like to say is that mold isn't quite as scary, I think, as the community might think in terms of ants' health. They can definitely survive in a formicarium that has mold present. There's plenty of molds and fungus present in the natural world where they live. Now, when it comes to mold outbreaks in test tubes, that can be a little bit different. I don't really recommend people keep ants in test tubes for very long. But if you're keeping them in there, you're going to want to make sure that you have areas that basically are free of mold available for them. So if you have a huge mold outbreak inside your test tube, definitely offer them a new test tube or a new space to live. And they'll move over when they need to. The ants are very good at managing their living environments, so we don't need to worry too much about that. It looks like we had a question about managing mites. Again, usually mites are present in formicariums. They just eat refuse. They're not a threat to the ants, but they definitely don't give any benefit aesthetically to the formicarium. You can get predatory mites, but those can be quite expensive. Parasitic mites are a whole different beast, where if you have a queen that you catch that have parasitic mites, or maybe you collect a colony and then you notice the parasitic mites are on them, that can be a whole different scenario to deal with. I'm not sure about predatory mites going after parasitic mites. I've never done that before, but it's certainly possible that would work. It looks like Tenebris has had that experience before. But I've been able to manage small populations of mites using paintbrushes and a little bit of lemon juice mixed with water. And you just spread that on the ant that is affected. The ant will clean itself off, but the mites will usually detach and you're able to get rid of them. What I actually have is a little CO2 gun that I can use. So if you put an affected ant into a small container, shoot the CO2 into the container, you can actually kind of knock the ant out. It won't kill the ant unless you leave it in there for a long time, but you can actually put the ant kind of to sleep and then remove the mites that way as well. Okay, here's another question. How could we confirm an ant species prefers different formicariums? Well, that's not an easy question to answer, but I'll give it a shot. You want to design the formicarium. Yes, we can talk more about the CO2 gun, so I'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, you want to design the formicarium or purchase formicarium based on the biology of the ants. So if you look at, okay, what's an ant colony like this? What's the inside of it look like? How is the nest structured? What kinds of areas are they nesting in? It's like Sol said, it's best to understand their natural environment. But over time, we've come to better understand those needs for quite a few of the species that are frequently kept in captivity. That being said, it's not an exact science. We don't know all of these different things perfectly. So there's a lot of trial and error. And that's one of the great things about the ant keeping community is that we've got so many folks working on different ant species, different formicaria, that they can actually do the kind of testing for us. So we can learn from their successes and failures as well. Okay, yes, we can talk. Yes, we can talk more about the CO2 gun now. I will post a link to the CO2 gun that I have. It just takes little CO2 cartridges, and you can kind of knock out insects using it. If you have a more specific question, I'd be happy to answer that. But no, you may not use your airsoft gun. All right. But, okay. Are there any other questions before I move on to another topic? Red asks, is it a lack of O2 or the use of CO2? Could I use nitrous? I don't know the answer to that. But CO2 has been used for quite a while by insect keepers. So I would recommend using CO2 because we know that it works. You could certainly try nitrous and try it out on workers you find outside. But my understanding is that it's probably the lack of oxygen that is affecting the ant more so than the presence of CO2. Okay, Josh asks, are 3D printed nests equal to acrylic nests, or are they better or worse? We'll actually talk about that a little bit later on today, so I will cover that. Hold me to it, but I want to talk about some other stuff before I get to that. Are bioactive formicarium recommended over your traditional nest? I'm not sure what my traditional nests mean, but I prefer to keep ants in environments that I can control more. So I keep them in hydrostone formicariums connected to outworlds. But you certainly can keep ants in bioactive tanks. You're just much less likely to see the activity in the colony. And as a scientist, that activity is really important to my work. Okay. Big Gandalf would like us to move on. I'm not sure what we're moving on to, but we can do that. How would a 3D printed nest hydration system work? Again, I'll talk about 3D printing and laser cutting later on. Okay, do most Campanose species hollow out their own nests out themselves, or do they just house in already hollowed out wood? Good question. So they usually are going to dig out the nest themselves unless they find kind of a pre-built area from, say, a beetle larva or something. But in my experience, the queens will usually dig out the founding chamber in some rotting wood. That's great. They'll make that, and then they'll expand, usually throughout kind of the log that they're in. Mr. I Love the Ants asks, what are your thoughts on keeping multiple species in the same setup? Well, that's a really good question. And it's not an easy answer. You have to really understand the species that you're housing. So I have had success in the past with housing Campanodus vicinus, for example, with Temnothorax. Temnothorax is a small ant, usually called acorn ants, and that can work okay. The large Campanodus usually don't mess with the smaller ants when there's still food abundantly available, but you will see a little bit of predation that occurs, and you could lose some ants. So it's a risk that you have to be aware of. That being said, if you're basically you want to make sure that you're keeping two ant species of very different sizes and very different behavior. Another thing that you can do is keep a species that you know to be primarily nocturnal and a species you know to be primarily diurnal. So nocturnal, that means they forage at night. Diurnal means they forage during the day. I also recommend having the entrances small enough that ants of each other's of the two different species can't enter the nests of the other ants. Now, if this is a totally bioactive Formicarium, you might not be able to do that. Okay. Do you recommend merging polygynous species? By the way, the pronunciation is polygyne, polygynous, not polygyne, just so everybody knows that. Should you merge them when they are queens or once they get workers, and how should you merge them, if at all? I really would recommend that you merge the queens right after they're collected. If you wait to merge polygynous species after they have workers, or even a few weeks after they were collected, I see that the success of doing so drops significantly. They're kind of more in the mode to accept other queens right after their nuptial flights. The Empire of the Desert Ants documentary by the BBC actually has a great little, segment kind of on pleiometrosis, which is when multiple queens come together to start a colony. Now, I can definitely pronounce that slower. So polygynous means poly is many. Gyne is another word for queen. Okay, so polygynous means a multiple queen species, to be of multi-queen, essentially. Question, is this polymer clay such as Fimo, I don't know what that is, or Sculpey safe to use for ants as small feeding dishes for both protein and sugar water? I assume that you mean that the clay has been fired, but if you could clarify that, that would really be helpful. I do not know really the answer to your question. I prefer to use water-based clays, but I also don't make feeding dishes out of clay. I use a laser cutter to create little feeding dishes. Okay. Is it possible to provide wood nesting species with small, old wooden trunks in captivity, or would they mold? That's a good question. And it doesn't have a super simple answer. But what I would say is that you can take, wood material from the wild, especially if it's started to decompose. That can be helpful. But if you have a lot of ventilation in the container that it's kept in, you're not likely to see a ton of mold, but you can see some mold growth. So when I'm designing, say, an exhibit for Madagascar hissing cockroaches, for example, usually we'll use real wood, And right at the beginning, that wood will mold, but the mold does fade away over about a month, where the organisms can feed on it, and then the mold also kind of dies back as it consumes the organic material on the outside of the log. I'm hearing a lot of typing.
My bad.
No worries.
Who was that?
I'll keep it down.
Okay.
Oh, I see. Okay, I'm gonna just mute.
So, Seraphine says there's also primary and secondary polygamy. Start with multiple, add more after founding. Not all species that are secondary polygynous can found with more than one queen. That's true. Sometimes colonies will combine, but that usually is not a successful thing to do when you're in captivity. But you're absolutely right. There's also something different than polygynous and pleometronic or pleometrosis. I'll spell that out right now. So pleometrosis is the act of multiple queens coming together to found a colony, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those multiple queens will exist in the colony indefinitely, or for perpetuity. The species may actually only tolerate one queen in an established colony. So Tetramorium immigrans, for example, is a pleometronic species where they will start colonies with multiple queens, but then they'll actually reduce down to one queen over time. Tenebris says, I think the chances of success are better if the queens are related. Yes, they seem to be better when the queens are related, but that's not necessarily well studied in lots of ant species. Yeah, Milt is also correct. Sometimes Tetramorium queens will kill one another while they're in the colony, but oftentimes they will survive until the first workers arrive, and then basically it's carnage. So that dude Chris asks, so with pleometrosis, should you remove the queens yourself or let the ants kill off the other queens? That's a good question. It depends on the kind of environment that you're founding them with. I usually let the ants do what they want to do, because they generally have a good sense of what queens are kind of the weakest, which ones are the strongest, and they eliminate them based on that. There's also a risk that you will end up with 0 queens. That's definitely happened to me in the past, where they'll actually kill each other if you're founding with 2 queens or a couple, and that's really unfortunate. So you just have to be aware that that's a risk you're taking, especially when those queens are armed with formic acid, or if they sting each other, you can really kind of lose all the queens there. Do you think Ant Society has applications for ours? What are some examples? Okay, I'm going to ask that you hold on to that question. I'm going to keep moving through the fundamentals of Formicaria, and then we'll talk about that once we move on, okay? So now I'd like to talk about heating. We already discussed a little bit about heat lamps, but there's also heating pads, heating cables, and then also the heat in the room that you're keeping the ants in. So as a reminder, I'm taking questions about formicariums specifically, and then at the end of that session, we'll actually open it up to more broad questions. So no worries if you missed that, but just hold on to those questions. I'll address them at that point in time. All right. So with heating, I prefer to use heating cables that are controlled with a little control module. Heating cables could be bought like reptile heating cables from Zoomed, and other brands are available online. You can also order them from a site called McMaster Car. Those are a little bit higher quality, a little bit higher price as well, but they're longer. You can chain link them together and control them better. So those are the ones that usually go into major exhibits. Heating pads can be risky. Heating pads can really heat up the formicarium, and it's harder to control where the heat's being applied. But that being said, heating pads can work, especially the small ones. You just want to make sure that you're not getting any of the formicariums too hot. You can really kill your ants that way. Okay, we have another question. Using AAC, autoclaved aerated concrete, fire brick, plaster, or grout, would you recommend heat cables over pads? I use heat cables with formicariums like that. Other folks have great luck with heating pads. Some people really like to use heating lamps. But really what you need to do, no matter what methodology you're using to heat the colonies, you need to make sure that those nests aren't getting too hot. Me being a privileged scientist, I actually have a heat laser kind of gun that will tell me where the heat is. But what you can do is use a small thermometer to kind of measure what the heat is inside of the nest. You definitely want to have a heating gradient in your nest. So that way the ants can partition themselves and their brood throughout the Formicarium, depending on their heat needs. Okay. Would ants evacuate the nest before being cooked? Usually, they will evacuate the nest. However, if you're keeping them in something like a test tube or a small Formicarium, there's nowhere for them to go. So that's where the risk really kind of comes in if you're using a non-discriminate heat source like a heat lamp, for example. Definitely, if you have, say, a heating cable on a test tube or the side of a Formicarium, and all of the ants are crowding to the exact opposite side, the coolest possible area, chances are that Formicarium is way too hot. So you need to reduce that temperature. When you see ants bundled together and just in a big pile in one area, that usually is an indicator that something is wrong. They will generally be more spread throughout the nest if they're comfortable and conditions are right. The Tar Heel ant's mini hearth, for example, is a great Formicarium. If you see every single ant in the colony all hiding, kind of together above the water dish. I don't know why I'm blanking on what that's called, but the water dish inside that nest,
Water
where
tower.
the humidity, water tower. There we go. If they're all right above the water tower, chances are that nest is too dry, so you're going to want to moisturize it just a little bit. Okay, so I'm just reading through questions right now. What is the proper way of heating test tubes trying to avoid condensation as well? Heating test tubes is definitely a challenge. There's no great answer to that. Milta or someone else might have some more feedback on this. But if I need to heat a test tube, I always drape a heating cable over the top of the very kind of open end of the test tube. And if you guys have seen my videos, I always have the test tubes at an angle so that if the water was to flood because of a major temperature imbalance, the ants actually have high ground to go to. That being said, I'm not a big fan of heating test tubes at all because it's just hard to control that environment. I prefer heating Formicaria a lot better. Milta says, don't cook your ants. That's really the takeaway here as well. Red, looks like you need to just use a little dropper or syringe and moisturize the inside of the nest just a little bit. That being said, the water tower is a pretty comfortable place for the ants to live. So if there's only a few ants in the colony and they're all right there with the queen and the brood, I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's really when you have a large colony and they're all surrounding the one source of water, that's a good indicator that your nest is too dry. Yes, Tenebris is also correct. The condensation from heating test tubes can be dangerous to the ants if it forms big droplets. I've definitely lost queens when I was first starting keeping ants because condensation would drip onto the brood. You never want water to be touching the brood of your ants. Okay. So I've gone over heating. Now, some materials. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, Red. Ant keeping really is a pretty new hobby. We're still learning how to do it. And there's definitely a lot of failure associated with it. We all deal with it. I deal with it all the time, even though I've been doing this for over 10 years now. So don't feel bad about it. It's part of the learning process. And if you're respecting your ants, doing your best with them, that's really the best that we can do. Okay, so materials. I'm going to cover plasters. Ray and I have both discussed this in detail. I recommend using plasters like Hydrostone, Hydrocal, Ultracal. You never want to use plaster of Paris. The other thing is that I don't design plaster nests such that they will always be in contact with water. There are different people who have tried that before. Usually the plaster begins to erode. A big thing that you need to know about with plaster is that you should be creating plaster nests using, deionized water, distilled water, filtered water. You don't want to be using tap water where you're going to get hard deposits. Yes, Sol, I'll talk about plaster of Paris here in a moment. The other thing is that when you're mixing the plaster and the plaster base, you always want to use the exact same kind of water that you're going to be watering the nest with. If you switch that, that seems to kind of exacerbate the issues where the plaster will kind of fall apart, or you'll get calcium deposits and other materials coming out of the plaster. So you want to be watering with the same kind of water that you use to create the nest. There's tons of different reasons why that is, and I can discuss that in detail at a different point in time, but I do want to keep moving here. You don't want to use plaster of Paris, number one, because it seems to be a lot more susceptible to mold growth. Of course, the mold isn't growing on the plaster material itself, but the mold seems to take on plaster of Paris much better than on plasters like Hydrostone or Hydrocal. Another thing is that plaster of Paris is quite a bit softer. It'll break down over time. Some ants can actually chew through it. But the big reason we don't use plaster of Paris is because it's not as strong, and it's definitely quite a bit less mold resistant. You might look up and see that Hydrostone and plaster of Paris don't have major differences in composition, but kind of anecdotally and through research, it's pretty clear that they are definitely different materials when it comes to keeping ants in nests made of those materials. Now, I get a lot of questions about grout. What I will say is that I've never had a colony successfully raised in a grout-based formicarium. I've definitely seen them online. Looks like some folks have a great time using grout with no issues. My ants seem to be very adverse to the different kinds of grout that I've used to create nests with them. So that's an area that I'm not as familiar with. So I always recommend Hydrostone and Hydrocal. Hydrocal can be found a little bit easier than Hydrostone, but usually Hydrostone is available in larger batches or larger quantities. Okay, so Waitong autoclaved aerated concrete. There are different types, different kind of grades of that material. You want to be using usually the material that looks pretty bright white and has small holes. We'll see you later, Josh. Thanks for tuning in. But back to the Waitong, they're different grades. The Europeans seem to really have figured out which ones are best, and I would definitely direct those questions to them. Looks like Seraphine's already working on that a little bit. Plastics. So I get so many questions about 3D printed plastics and laser cut acrylic. Now, these materials themselves are not bad for ants. They're not dangerous for ants, as far as I know, at least most of them. However, quite a few of the nest designs that have been made using plastics don't account for the proper distribution of moisture and humidity, and they also don't have any substrate. So ant colonies tend to not do nearly as well in those kinds of nests because they don't meet all of their needs. And I'm always happy to help people if they have questions about how to design a 3D printed nest or what kind of factors they need to take into account when they do so. I'm always happy to help with that. There's quite a bit of potential when it comes to 3D nests and laser cut acrylic or CNC'd acrylic. That being said, we just have to kind of think about our designs a little bit more carefully, in my opinion, so that you can really meet the needs of your ants. Seed harvesting ants seem to do very well in things like acrylic nests with a little bit of a plaster base, for example. But one of the main issues that I see with the 3D printed nests and the acrylic nests is that because they have no substrate, the moisture just builds up. So you can get a lot of condensation that threatens the ants, and there's nowhere for that water to go. It's going to sit as liquid rather than actually be kind of absorbed into a material, which is a little bit of a safer condition for those ants. The other issue with 3D printed nests and acrylic nests that don't have any kind of substrate or absorbent material is that when the ants bring in food waste, or they actually the ants don't necessarily poop or pee, it's more of something in the middle, but they do have waste products that they have. When they deposit that, it doesn't get soaked up into a material like wood or soil would in the wild, so it kind of builds up inside of those nests. And that can encourage bacteria, it can encourage mold growth. It's really not the sanitary kind of nest condition that you want to have in an ant colony. Okay. I'm just reviewing questions here. Okay. Have you ever seen anyone raise a colony in a 3D printed nest? That's got some downvotes. I'm certain that people have raised colonies, successful colonies in 3D printed nests. However, I haven't seen a whole lot of them. And really the key for me when I'm looking at a nest type is actually not whether or not the queen can get her first workers, but whether or not the colony does well in those nests over a longer period of time. And as I was talking about earlier, there is a difference between humidity and kind of the moisture of the substrate and of the nest itself. So quite a few of those nests have high humidity, but they don't necessarily have kind of a moisture gradient in the material. And anecdotally, I think that that's an important thing for some ant species. Okay, so wood. Wood can be a great material to use with ant colonies, but you really have to think through how you use it. The other thing is that in high humidity or high moisture situations, you can see quite a bit of mold, bacteria, or algae that build up on that material. And there aren't very many species that are really well suited to a wood nest, but there are some Camponotus nests that have been made out of wood that seem to be very well. The key is that that nest actually has lower humidity, and you provide the ants with quite a bit of moisture in like attached test tubes or certain areas in the nest. Okay, and then finally, soil. We already talked about that. The soil, you're going to want to sterilize it in the oven if you got it out in nature. And by washing the soil, you do reduce that kind of fine dust that shows up. So one question, can you show us some of your favorite or most recommended nest styles? I'm not going to be able to do that today, but I would like to just say that I prefer nest styles that are a little bit more naturalistic. I like ones that kind of focus on mimicking the ant's natural environment. And I like ones that are made of absorbent materials. But as a researcher, as an ant keeper, those are my preferences. That's not necessarily, a fact in terms of the very best nest is made of those materials. But from my experience, from Ray's experience, a lot of the folks I know in the ant keeping hobby, the absorbent kind of naturalistic nests seem to yield better colonies over a long period of time. Okay, Tenebrous asks, not sure if this is the right moment to ask, but I've found that ants which fall in water and drown can be resuscitated when you leave them out to dry, even hours later. How do they survive in this state for so long? So insects have very different respiratory systems, essentially, to what humans do. And they certainly can be underwater for some time without oxygen and definitely be resuscitated. I'm not going to go into that too far. I don't want to get terribly off topic. But say if you find a queen in a pool of water, you can definitely fish her out, put her in a container with just slightly moist cotton. And as they dry out and are subject to oxygen and airflow, they sometimes will be resuscitated. Okay. Excellent. And then the last topic I wanted to talk about with formicariums is just that the size of the formicarium does matter. You don't want to have a whole lot of empty kind of open space that the ants aren't using, because they'll generally put their trash there rather than out in the outworld, which is a better place because you can actually pull that material out of the outworld. One thing that I do is if I see ants allocating their trash inside of the nest, or if they're just putting their trash all over, you can actually train some species to put their trash in a certain area. So I tend to move, using forceps or a brush, the trash that they deposit in the nest into like a corner of the outworld. And over time, many of the species that I keep will actually identify that area as a refuse pile, and that's where they'll start putting their trash. So you can kind of train the ants to put their trash in certain areas. We do that with leafcutter ants all the time for major exhibits. You can make certain containers that go off of the main chambers, fill them with the ants' trash, and then the ants actually identify those areas as refuse chambers, and they'll use them for the rest of time with that method. Okay, yes, as Sol noted, please hold off on topic questions until the general question session. The good news is I'm just about ready to transition to that. Do we have any other questions based on kind of the fundamentals of making Formicaria or identifying the right kind of Formicarium for the ants that you have. Well, as those questions come in, I just want to thank everybody for coming in today. There's a whole bunch of folks in the chat room. That is awesome. I love seeing that. As Sol says, now is a good time to ask those questions that maybe I didn't see or didn't answer. What I'm not going to do is focus on individual, like personal questions related to your specific ant colonies. I can do that separately, but today we're going a little bit more general. I do not personally keep ATA.
Miles, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, now with bigger species such as Myrmecias in, well, Lubulan in Australia, and larger species around the world, would you still recommend a test tube founding stage with an outworld, or would you rather go with like a more flatter ground surface with the bigger species?
Mm-hmm. I definitely prefer to found those colonies in the hydrostone-based petri dish nests that I make. As I said earlier today, I'm going to actually show you guys how to make those. Those are really standard in laboratories. I prefer to raise my ants not in test tubes. That is not the method that I recommend folks use, but I do know that they're cheap and they're easy to find and easy to use. Especially with large ants, if you don't have a nest that can adequately allow them to move their brood around and move around inside the nest, you need to really reevaluate that nest system to ensure that those ants can move around and do their natural behaviors. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much. Just, are you gonna do a YouTube video about the petri dishes?
Yes, that's actually in the works right now.
Okay, sweet. I'll wait for that until I make
Yep.
the ants.
So as many of you know, it takes a while to get those videos out. We put a lot of work in them. I've got a whole team that works on that, but we're doing our absolute best to get those videos out as quickly as we can and still maintaining the high level of quality that we shoot for. So I'm hoping to get that petri dish nest out in the coming week or two and get that out to you guys. Okay, yes. Do we have other voice questions?
Why is so stupid?
Oh my.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know who that was.
No worries. Okay. So what I'm actually going to do now is transition to broader questions. So broader questions about ant keeping, the science of myrmecology, that kind of thing. I'll be happy to take those questions at this time.
Could I quickly ask a question about materials?
Yes.
Is just aerated concrete the same as autoclaved aerated concrete? Because I can only find aerated concrete.
So is aerated concrete the same as autoclaved aerated concrete? Not to my knowledge, no. I don't think it's the same. But I could be wrong about that. We don't really use autoclaved aerated concrete or aerated concrete here in the United States as much. It's just not available. So I have less knowledge about that particular topic. The European group on this Discord might have great answers with regards to that. Okay, I'm going back up here. Question, can we do this again? I would love to do this again. It does take some time and preparation, but we'll probably get this done again at some point. I love engaging with the community, taking your questions, and it really helps me not only be a better ant keeper, but better educate the community, which is one of my big goals with the Ant Network. Okay, one question here, how to become a myrmecologist. So for those who don't know, a myrmecologist is somebody who studies ants. It's a special area of entomology, which is the study of insects, that focuses on ants. Now, myrmecology is a pretty competitive field. There's quite a few folks who are interested in studying ants, and that's great for the ant keeping community, and it's great for ant keepers and really anyone who's interested in ants. I recommend that if folks want to be a career myrmecologist, that they pursue a degree in something like entomology, ecology, zoology, and then go on for actually graduate school in the field of entomology, working with ants. All right, I'm going to keep looking through here.
I have a question.
Okay.
I found that the thing with polygynous Myrmica colonies, I found it quite vague. I saw that there are theories that they evolve like a super colony, but in my case, it was the complete opposite. They rejected the queens, and I'm not really sure how to think of that as, are they really polygynous, or are they just, I don't know, occasionally, or if it suits the needs? How is with that? Is it concrete, or is it something very variable?
Yes, that's a good question. So, just as a reminder, we are dealing. Biology doesn't really deal with absolutes on kind of a behavioral level, right? So there's never, we can never say for 100% certain that ants will do one thing or another. It also really depends on the species of Myrmica that you're dealing with. Myrmica rubra, yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, so Myrmica rubra is a widespread species throughout Europe, and there are reports actually that Myrmica rubra have spread into, I think, Canada. And I'm not sure which population you're dealing with, but it's absolutely true to say that those the active polygynous founding and polygynous ant species, it's not there's no absolute there, right? So some queens will accept each other than other ones. And I'd be happy to help you on a more personal basis, but I want to move on to another question because that's a pretty complex question to answer.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yes, Aunt Duchess, we are still doing this. Right now, we're focused on general questions related to ants. We've moved on from the Formicarium focus. Okay, do I have much experience with social parasites? I have some experience with social parasites. I currently have a Lasius, I think it's subumbratus colony going on right now. And I've had some success with Formica social parasites. In general, they're a difficult kind of ant to get started. And I definitely don't recommend folks who haven't kept ants before to try and do that, or at least to put all of their eggs in one basket with a parasitic Lasius or a parasitic Formica. Noble's absolutely right. That spiderfish has done some great work with trying to teach people how to deal with parasitic Lasius. He's actually worked with parasitic Formica as well. Okay, here's a question. A country with nothing on insect studies, what would be the best option for myrmecology? So if you're interested in myrmecology and there are no programs in your home country, you can definitely apply for programs outside of your country as an international student. But if maybe they don't have an entomology focus at an undergraduate institution that you're going to, you can major in something like ecology, wildlife biology, zoology, and then actually pursue graduate school that's more focused on entomology.
If I can cut in really quick, Pod, just to elaborate on your question a little bit, there's a good documentary called Ant Mountain by David Attenborough, and it covers different gradients of polygyny between even just ants on like the same, like within the same area. So yeah. If that's something you're interested in, I suggest looking it up.
Absolutely. Okay,
Thank
Big
you very
Gandalf,
much.
take care.
Thank you
All right. Yes, that is a phenomenal documentary. Okay. So if we don't have any other questions, I will just very briefly... Oh, here's one. Looks like I missed this one. I see it. Do you think Ant Society has applications for ours? What are some examples? Absolutely. So part of the interest of studying ants is that ants are eusocial insects. They're highly social, right? And you know what else is highly social? Humans. And there's quite a bit that we've actually already learned about from ants that we've applied to humanity. I'm not sure which telescope it is. One of the telescopes that searches for, I think, Goldilocks planets uses an algorithm that was partly determined by studying how ant colonies actually search for food in an efficient and effective manner. We also can model how ants move around the world when it comes to, like, say, moving packages for package moving services, how we design train railways. There's lots of different design challenges that ants can help inform us. So the applications are kind of endless. And I don't want to ramble on too much, but what I would say is that there are tons of applications from what we learn about ants that we can apply to humanity. And those applications even translate over to microbiology. We study ants because of how they manage the microbiome of their living environment to help us understand how maybe we can improve the way that we sanitize environments as well. So it's an endless thing, and it's part of what excites me so much about learning about ants is that we actually learn a little bit more about the human condition and the way that we can actually solve design challenges that the ants have already solved for us.
I have another question. One is really about what you were saying. Is chemical democracy a real term? That I heard it in Edward O. Wilson's Empire of the Ants.
Uh-huh. Absolutely. So E.O. Wilson, or Ed Wilson, is one of the big pioneers of the ant keeping study, so myrmecology. And E.O. Wilson is highly respected for his work that he's done. But the specific question that you're talking about, the chemical democracy, from my point of view as an ant scientist, is essentially that ants work in a social system that is mostly controlled by the chemicals that they use, like the pheromones that they use to communicate. So there is no single ant in a colony that's in charge. The queen definitely is not in charge of the colony, although she does secrete and release pheromones and chemicals that help maintain kind of the colony's balance. Tenebris has a great idea here. He likes to think of each individual ant as a single neuron in a mind. So if you think of each ant maybe as a cell in a larger organism, that's where the idea of a superorganism comes from. And with every single ant working together, they can actually make decisions collectively, kind of based on a trial and error basis. So yes, it's kind of like a chemical democracy, but that's an anthropomorphized term, I think, that we're using to describe them.
That's what I was going for, yeah, because I used that term to explain to people how non-democratic we are. The second question is I think it's the one topic before, the distribution of Messer kind of baffles me. I hope that I'm not disturbing that I'm on the right, that this is the right question for now, because I have found literally none, and I've seen people have loads of nuptial flights, and I have a really many different habitats covering here in a small area, some dry, some humid, really many habitats, and I have found literally none. So is that the case, that the messers are just located where they find perfect conditions and they just do it all there and none else, not in other areas?
Yeah, so ants are distributed in the habitat that really can support them. I don't know where specifically you are. I don't want to get too far into that. But if you're not seeing ants in a certain habitat, they either haven't been exposed to it, or much more likely it's just not the right kind of habitat for the ants. Ants have been around for millions of years, and they live just about everywhere that they could live, at least in areas that they can get to. Of course, with like invasive species from different parts of the world, that's a different kind of case. But when we're talking about native ants, they're usually present in the habitats that can effectively support them. So if they're not there, there's generally a good reason for it. Okay, so Red Shield asks, how far away from the original nest would ant alates fly, Formica specifically? I don't have any data on how far Formica can fly. I know that queens have been found miles away from the nests that they usually would have taken off from, but that's not something that we really understand super well. It does depend on kind of the weather conditions, the wind, humidity, moisture, the whole set of environmental conditions can affect how far an ant might fly. But it's certainly true that some ant species definitely fly quite high in the air, and they can get quite far away from the nests that they're coming from. Okay, question, which paints are safe for ants? That's a good question. I can't speak comprehensively or give you brands or anything, but generally, acrylic-based paints seem to do just fine with ants, at least the ants that I have. We use acrylic-based paints to actually paint onto ants to track individual ants in a colony, but there are lots of different paints available. If you're thinking about painting an actual ant nest, you certainly want to use something that is waterproof and isn't going to give off any kind of chemical vapors that could endanger the colony. Now, when you actually are making a formicarium and you're trying to like dye plaster a certain color, I always recommend using kind of natural organic based or non-artificial based plaster dyes that are available. Okay. Why can social parasites not have their own colonies taking over others? Well, those social parasites have evolved to be dependent on the other ant species. So they actually lose their ability to live independent from them. And if you look at the build of social parasitic queens, they don't have the fat reserves, they don't have the build essentially to support themselves as they found a colony the way that a fully claustral queen can. So if you think of like a Lasius queen that is a fully claustral, like Lasius niger, those queens have lots of fat stores. They metabolize their wing muscles to support a growing colony. But if you look at a socially parasitic Lasius queen, they're very thin, they're streamlined, they're ready for battle. They don't have the ability really to start a colony without support from other ants. What types of glues are Formicarium safe? I've heard PVA glues may be safe. Well, I don't know about that too well. I only ever use certain kind of epoxies and resins, and then also aquarium-safe silicone. Once it has cured for at least 48 hours, it's usually absolutely fine to use with ants. You don't want to use water-based glues that might break down over time when exposed to moisture. And I will have a comprehensive list of glues that we know are Formicarium safe on the Ant Network website when it launches later this summer. Okay. How do I collect ants? Yes, I did just make a video about how to use an aspirator. And aspirators are great for collecting ant colonies. It helps you keep the ants a little bit more safe. With regards to kind of collecting, you don't want to smash the ants or hurt them with, say, forceps when you're collecting them. Aspirators are great because it's a hands-off approach that you just suck the ant pretty gently into a vial and they should be just fine. Milt is absolutely correct. You have to make sure that all of those glues dry, they air out properly. The fumes can definitely kill your ants. And usually that is a big surprise for people who are making DIY formicariums and they don't understand why the ants are dying. There's a question, have you ever noticed toxicity in superglue? I've never used superglue with ants, so I can't comment on that. Is silicone safe for ants? As I was saying earlier, yes. Aquarium grade silicone is safe for ants once it has fully cured. Okay, could you get a drone of a species and an unmated queen in a test tube and the unmated queen get mated that way? That certainly could happen, but it's not necessarily likely that they would actually mate in the nest inside the test tube. So when ants have nuptial flights, which are the mating flights where the queens will go and mate with between 1 and even 10 males, the conditions are really what helps get that started. and when you don't have the correct conditions, mating in ants is very unlikely, but I certainly won't say that it's not possible. I have seen it done before with a couple of people, but it's not the method I recommend. I certainly recommend going and finding a queen after a nuptial flight. Okay, somebody said, I've seen your videos where you aspirate ants without a filter. Someone crucified me for doing the same. Is a HEPA filter an important safety tool? Is it necessary always, or when should it be used? Well, I'm not qualified to give medical advice, so I can't, talk about that in any absolutes. You can use HEPA filters. I have used them before. I find that they get clogged a little bit faster. I'm not a huge fan of the BioQuip one for my own use, but it actually is great for hobbyists who don't use aspirators all of the time. But I find that the filters that I recommend cut down significantly on what I'm inhaling. But the HEPA filter is great if you're really concerned about getting like mold spores in your lungs. So I definitely don't recommend against it. It's just not my favorite one to use personally. Does the amount of times a queen mates affect the laying of eggs or growth of brood? Well, so if we think about evolution and natural selection, the more variability in kind of genetics and genetic composition, usually the healthier a animal species is going to be. So if a queen has sperm from multiple males, there could be attributes associated with that sperm, the kind of genetic composition that is advantageous to others. If you have a queen that only mates, say, with one male, but would generally mate with like 4 or 5 males, she'll probably have less sperm to use. So she'll be able to produce fewer workers in her lifetime. But if you look at like an Atta queen, for example, they mate with multiple males during their nuptial flight, and they'll have millions and millions of descendants throughout their lifetime. Okay, chat's moving pretty quick, so I'm trying to take a look at where other questions are.
What about incest? How are ants with that in general?
It's really hard to talk about that in general because it varies significantly among different. Some ants seem to do okay breeding ancestrally. Other ants can't do it at all. There's also the issue of hybrids that occur. So that's really something I think that I can talk about better in a dedicated video where we can really write it out, confirm with geneticists, and make sure that I have the right information there. I don't want to mislead you on that because it's such a complicated answer when it comes to the genetics of that. Okay, would you recommend forensic entomology as a career? Well, I'm not a forensic entomologist, but I certainly know quite a few who are. And forensic entomology is a critical part of law enforcement around the world. And it also helps us better understand kind of decomposition and the things that insects do, not only in ecosystems, but also in urban environments. It's one of those careers that is nice because it's not something that gets cut. You always have law enforcement working with forensic entomologists. So it can be a good career if it fits your personality. Okay, can multiple species live together in the same nest? I don't know if we're talking about a captive nest or in the wild, but you do have species like Solenopsis molesta, for example, which are thief ants, and they actually live inside other ant colonies, stealing their brood, stealing their food, and because they're so small and they mask themselves in the pheromones of the other ants, they're actually able to live pretty much unnoticed inside other ant species' nests. That being said, that's a harder thing to do in captivity. I've never done it successfully, but it's certainly something I'd like to do. Tenebris asked, I don't think ants do crossbreed. Is that even possible? It actually is possible in some populations. We have confirmed that species of Pogonomyrmex in the desert southwest actually create hybrids. So Pogonomyrmex rugosus and barbatus actually have a hybrid zone. I believe it's in New Mexico, but I could be wrong about the location, but it does occur in some species. Vexation asks, why can some ants mate ancestrally without problems while others can't? As I said just a minute ago, I'm not going to cover that topic here. It's too complicated, and it's not something I specialize in, so I'd have to talk with experts before I could answer that question. I've got it written down, though, so we might do an ant network video on that topic at some point. All right. Well, I've been talking for quite a while now. I just now and talk about the laws and permitting process in the United States. I already posted an infographic at one point that was really quite focused on kind of the basics of ant keeping in the United States and the laws. And instead of really going through that, I'd like to take any questions that you have about permits, about the laws related to ant keeping. And my focus would be on the United States. So I'm just going to wait here and see if we have any questions about that.
I think we had quite a few in the middle of things. They just, yeah. We asked people to just hold on to them for now.
Uh-huh.
So now's the time, guys.
Okay, what is the legality of keeping and selling ants in California? That's a good question. Every state has different laws related to the transportation and collection of ant colonies, okay? I'm not familiar specifically with California. It's a big state. It's a state that is very friendly towards regulating, especially when it comes to wildlife. But California ant keepers would know that better than I do. I think NERBS would be a great resource for you to ask with specifics in California's laws that relate to selling ants. Somebody just said, if I'm moving to a new state, how would you recommend I get permits to transfer my colonies? You're not going to like this, but it's highly unlikely that you're actually going to be able to get a permit to transfer your colony to another state. Permits are granted by the United States Department of Agriculture's Plant Protection and Quarantine Service, and they're focused with protecting states from kind of potential invasive species or animals that could hurt their agricultural operations. That because of that, they are not likely to grant a hobbyist a transport permit just so they can move their ant farm somewhere. I know it's not the answer that we'd like to see, but it is kind of the situation. It's unlikely you're going to be able to get a permit to move those ants to another state, particularly if you do not have a qualified containment facility. Okay, Seraphine says, one thing I know is that many counties in California have banned keeping and selling Invicta. So Solenopsis invicta is the red imported fire ant. It's actually caused billions of dollars in damage to the United States economy. It's Solenopsis invicta is specially regulated by the federal government and by state governments. You should never be moving Solenopsis invicta, especially to different counties. That itself could be an illegal action. If you're going to keep them, only keep very local Solenopsis invicta. That said, they're really not great ants for ant keeping. It's not something I recommend that most people do. And it's really hard to have a sustainable one for a long time. Somebody said, since you will inevitably be unable to answer all permit questions, where can we go to get more information for our state? So permits are handled by the federal government, so you can ask the Plant Protection and Quarantine Division about it. But if you're looking for state information, you want to contact folks who are at like your state wildlife management agency. So sometimes that's Fish and Game, sometimes it's like Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, for example. But they will usually know the collection aspect of it. With permits on the state level, you really want to be talking to the state agricultural department. They're the ones who are going to manage the agricultural aspects of pest species, potential pest species. Okay, to those folks who are logging off because this isn't relevant, thank you so much for coming in and listening and engaging. It's awesome to have you here, and have a great night. Okay, here's a question. How long can a nuptial flight delay because of weather? Well, that's not permit related, but I don't have permit related questions right now. I'll see that down there red. But nuptial flights can be delayed because of weather. pretty much indefinitely. If the weather, if the environmental conditions do not line up for a nuptial flight, it's not going to happen. So it will take time. Sometimes places like, I mean, even in Montana right now, we're about 3 weeks behind normal weather patterns here. So all the ant flights are all delayed a little bit from what they usually would do on an annual basis. Red said he asked the feds about transporting dead ants between the border between two states. They referred me to the state as well as to the feds. You need both, it seems. Well, that's actually not true. The federal government does not regulate the transport of dead insect specimens between states. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does regulate dead ant species or dead ant specimens or any insect specimens if they're coming in or out of the boundaries of the United States. But it's actually just the states who have any kind of relevant controls about dead specimens. That being said, almost no states have those regulations, so you are usually free to move dead insect specimens across state lines. That is not true with some, I think, bee species, so you got to be careful with that. Okay, Mango asks, is there a collection permit for some ants? I know in Europe there are protected nests of Formica rufa. I don't know of any protected ant species here in the United States. However, you cannot collect ants in certain areas, or you cannot remove wildlife from certain areas. So I work with the federal government and the National Park Service, for example. You cannot take any wildlife outside of a national park. So if you find a queen ant in, say, Yellowstone National Park, you're not allowed to collect her and take her home. There are different state levels of that. Some state parks do not allow collection, or they require a permit. So if you're collecting on ground that's not private ground, you need to talk to them. That being said, the national forests in the United States do not have any regulations for citizen collecting in a responsible and ethical manner. The Bureau of Land Management also doesn't have any regulation for that I'm aware of. So there are unique rules for each different kind, and you want to just pretty much ask first. It's usually better to ask first rather than trying to ask for forgiveness after you're caught. People really can be quite upset if you are disrupting the lands that are regulated. Okay. Soul asks, how difficult is it to get permits? And have you gone through the process as the manager of a lab environment or separately as an individual? It can be quite difficult to get permits. That really depends on the ant species you want to move, where your facility is located, and what the containment levels of the facility, what those containment levels are, okay? So right now I am actually going through the process of permitting with the Plant Protection and Quarantine Division for our lab here at Montana State University. But what I will say is that because it's so dependent on the species and what you need, there's no general answer. I can't say, oh, it'll take 2 months and you'll need like 3 emails with the feds. It really depends on what you're trying to do. And that's one thing that I want to convey is that it's just not an easy thing to do. So what I really recommend is that folks try and keep the species that they have around them, if at all possible. If you're trying to get a permit, get in touch with the Plant Protection and Quarantine Service. They'll be able to tell you the kind of containment standards that you need to meet in order to get those permits. But it's a pretty good bet that a regular hobbyist isn't going to be able to provide the containment conditions required to move most ant species between state lines, particularly ones that are not from adjacent states.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. In regards to collections, does that include public experimental forests? I can't speak on that. Each experimental forest is different depending on who it's managed by and what things are going on there. Tenebris Nova says that Formica rufibarbus is another protected species in the United Kingdom. There's 2 or 3 wild nests left. Their locations are kept secret. Absolutely. It's not an issue that we really have run into in the United States. That being said, we do have the unfortunate experience of having international smugglers who actually come to the U.S. and try and smuggle our ant species out. One of the ones that's targeted the most are actually the honeypot ants and harvester ants of the desert Southwest. And that is a problem, and it is something that the federal government is not only aware of, but is working to address. If folks are asking you to ship ants overseas and they say that it's legal and they don't have permits, they're lying to you. And you can be potentially charged, and they will also be potentially charged as well for violating international law. So really ask the authorities if you're ever concerned. Okay, I'm going to be ending this here pretty soon. I'll only answer a couple more questions. Let me review what we've got here. As keepers, what should we be doing in terms of responsibility that are not covered by? What could we be doing as keepers to show that we want to protect our hobby, especially as the hobby gets more and more popular? Sol, this is something I think about a lot. I spend a lot of time thinking about how our hobby is interfacing with regulatory authorities. So one thing that I do is I've built up a relationship with the USDA, and some folks might criticize you for doing that, but I think it's important that we represent ourselves in a responsible manner, in a professional manner, and we are able to advocate for the hobby coming from a place of information. So we want to make sure that we're informed about the ants. We want to make sure that we understand the ecology of ants when we're dealing with the federal government or state regulators, so that we can effectively and honestly advocate for our hobby. Biopirates, biopiracy, the folks who illegally sell ants or take our organisms out of the country illegally, they threaten not only our way of life because it threatens our agricultural systems, our natural ecosystems, but they really threaten the hobby. So it's absolutely fundamental that hobbyists build up a culture based around ethical ant keeping, ethical ant collection. So somebody asked here, what's the best way to report when we see illegal activity such as selling of ants on eBay? You can give the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Plant Protection and Quarantine Agency, you can give them a call. They actually have a tip line, or you can email them and submit an anonymous tip. That tip line is actually listed in the document. I think it's pinned somewhere here that I produced. That being said, sometimes it's best to talk to a senior member of the ant keeping community, send them the link, ask them what they think, because sometimes it's not an illegal practice, sometimes it is. And we don't want to be reporting people who are doing things illegally. Somebody said that they've seen people report illegal traders on Facebook and no action is taken to stop them. It might seem like that. And the gears of law and justice do turn slowly, but they do turn. And what you do see actually is that the USDA has stepped up enforcement on people who are trading ants illegally and doing risky things for the environment. Of course, the federal government has the ability to enforce those laws as they see fit. So if they see an activity that they're not concerned about, they'll be less likely to interfere. But I can tell you what, they are watching. And it's an important thing that they do that. And I would definitely say that the laws in the system is not perfect. There are quite a few areas that I think need to be changed, but the best way for us to advocate for the hobby and to make things better for ant keepers is to do what we do professionally. We want to make sure that we are respectful and that we advocate for ourselves effectively, and that's something that I do really on a weekly basis with regulatory powers. Yes, Chinese laws are different. I cannot talk about Chinese or international law. And as a reminder, I am not a lawyer, so I cannot provide legal advice with regards to any of these things. But what I can do is communicate the information that I've been given by the relevant authorities. Okay, everybody. I'd be happy, if you want to turn your mics on or whatever. I'm going to be calling it good here. I think we've had a great session today. It's been great talking to you guys. I hope you got a little bit out of this, and I really appreciate you all turning out for this.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thanks, Miles.
Thank you. It's really been good. I'm just
as a note, I don't know. I've been doing so much muting. I don't know who's manually muted anymore. So if you were manually muted, just stay in the chat and I'll manually unmute you. Otherwise, when you join voice again, you'll be muted still, I think.
Thank you.
My only problem is that I calculated the time zone wrong, so I got an hour late. But it was really great. Thank you very much.
No worries. You're welcome. This probably won't be the last time we do this. So if you folks have other topics you're interested in or suggestions, you can direct them to Sol or myself. I wouldn't say that this is going to be like a weekly thing or anything, but I would love to do this again. I really enjoy talking to the community, especially in a little bit of a less formal setting. And I think it really improves our ability to communicate and have a good discussion about ant keeping. You know, I love this hobby. I love the community. Thank you all very much. There's a question there. What is the YouTube channel? That is The Ant Network. So it's www.youtube.com/The Ant Network. We also have a website and everything else. And we're really focused on effectively helping people learn how to keep ants and using ants in a broader educational sense when we do like zoo exhibits, children's museum exhibits, and I go to classrooms and do presentations. So the Ant Network is a multifaceted organization, and it's great to have you guys supporting it as much as you do. I love that. If you enjoy what we do, please do give it a like, not to get too, advertisement kind of based here, but we do really appreciate that support. And when you share it with your friends, that helps us grow and improve the hobby and improve what we're doing.
Yeah, if you want to give Miles better visibility overall, there's a reason that like YouTubers, and it's really awkward. It puts them in a weird position because it's a meme, right? Like, subscribe, comment, yeah, all that stuff. Hit the bell icon. Welcome to the AC family, all that. When the reason that they do that is because it's not that they're trying to look for validation. What it actually does is it helps them with the YouTube algorithm itself. As you do all those things, as you hit the bell icon, subscribe, comment, like, and you even sharing, because that is tracked by YouTube metrics. As those links are clicked externally and people navigate to individual sites, individual videos. All those little things are just little bumps in the algorithm that helps Miles getting his visibility. So if you it's not just if you want to support us and it makes him feel good or whatever. It's not that. It's literally actively helping him win this war against the YouTube algorithm. So if you're looking to help him, actually do those things.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and you're absolutely right. It does make us feel good to see that, but that's not the reason we're doing it. My team and I, there's quite a few of us working on this stuff. We work really hard on producing this content because we love this hobby and we want to promote it. So if you share those values, if you like what we do, sharing it, liking it, subscribing, that's really what helps us reach more people and improve ant keeping as a whole. So thank you so much to everybody who came in today. I really appreciate that. I got to go feed a couple dozen ant colonies in our laboratory. But this was great. So
yeah,
take care, everybody. Thank you very much.
When employing, let us know.
What do you feed it?
All right.
When employing or recruiting, let us know. I'm afraid of flying, but I'll fly in a second.
Okay. Good to know. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. I'll be logging off now.
All right. See ya.
Thanks, Miles.
Thanks a lot.